I'm Mark Borton, and we're delighted to welcome the Honourable Kevin Rudd to this session, which is looking at the future of globalization. Mr. Rudd is the President and CEO of the Asia Society, and of course served as Australia's 26th Prime Minister during 2007 to 2010. He's also a leading authority on China, having begun his career as a China scholar and served as an Australian diplomat in Beijing prior to entering Australian politics. Mr. Rudd, welcome and thank you for joining us.
Good to be with you.
So if I can just kick off, now we're a few months into the Biden administration and the tenure of the Biden administration. How would you assess the state of US-China relations? And what would you highlight as maybe 2 or 3 areas that need to be focused on in order to enhance the relationship?
Well, the benchmark we should apply to the current state of US-China relations is what was the relationship like by the end of the Trump period. At the end of the Trump period, it was a bit like riding a roller coaster ride at an amusement park, either at Blackpool Luna Park in Sydney, or perhaps out on Coney Island if you're an American. In other words, you never quite knew whether this thing was going to go or whether it actually stay on the tracks at the end of the day. However, I think what we've seen with the election of the Biden administration is a smoothing out of the roller coaster. It is a much more disciplined administration. It is a more strategically literate administration. It is a more policy literate administration and more professional. And so if I was to characterize it, it would be along these lines. What we've seen is the US-China relationship become more strategically stable, less given to what I describe as a rolling sense of crisis. However, within that framework of strategic stability, it is still highly strategically competitive across all domains, from national security policy, foreign policy, trade, investment, technology, capital markets, through to human rights. Turning to the future, I think the big areas for the relationship to be dealt with will be to find a level of modus vivendi between the two sides on the most contentious national security questions of Taiwan, the South China Sea, the East China Sea, as well as cyber. That may sound like pie in the sky, but establishing some rules of the road in these domains is critical to sustain long-term stability. If there are 2 other areas I would recommend for work between the 2 administrations, it would be to work on as it were, a normalization of the trade relationship. The tariff regime imposed by both sides has certainly not advantaged the United States. I doubt that it's advantaged China either. And to work out within that a modus vivendi on the future of the technology trade. Final one is climate change, where fortunately the progress so far has been relatively positive in the first 100 days, led by former Secretary of State John Kerry. And so therefore, the 2 sides working collaboratively on climate between now and the Glasgow Conference of the Parties for the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change due in November this year, I think has real prospects of producing some positive results.
Yeah, thank you for that. I think the climate one is particularly interesting. And maybe you could just expand on that a little.
Well, on climate change questions, you'll find that the Chinese and the Americans, despite the public diplomatic bluster, by and large have a common set of scientific imperatives bearing down on each of those 2 national governments. And that is the US administration under Biden is deeply scientifically driven on climate, unlike the denialism we saw under Trump. It knows that it has a national responsibility to act on climate change, because if it fails to do so, the national environmental and economic consequences for the United States, quite apart from its friends, partners, and allies around the world, by mid-century would start to become catastrophic. Similarly, science drives the Chinese. As a bunch of Marxist-Leninists, they have long taken, like the old Soviet Union, what's called the hard physical sciences seriously. And so their own scientific establishments over the last 7 or 8 years have reached a complete consensus that, again, if climate change is left unchecked, that the environmental consequences for China in flood, in drought, in extreme weather events would impose massive economic costs on the country and be deeply internally disruptive. So therefore, China, for its own national economic and environmental imperatives, is also moving towards a much more aggressive position on national action to bring down greenhouse gas emissions from itself. The timetabling of all this over the next 30 years is the critical question if we're to keep global temperature increases within 1.5 degrees centigrade. But if your question was, how serious are both these governments on climate action? My answer is, I think, quite serious, not because they love each other, quite the reverse, but because it's in their own national economic environmental interest to act.
Yeah, thank you. Just for a moment, just moving on to some recent articles that I read, I was particularly struck by a proposal that you made around managed strategic competition, and that talks about an agreed joint strategic framework between the USA and China. Would you be able to expand on that a little bit for our delegates?
Well, when anyone in the finance sector or the banking sector is looking at the future of the US-China relationship, people in finance, like in other sectors of the international economy, are craving a level of strategic stability. And how can you actually obtain that in the presence of structural competition, deep strategic competition between the United States and China? Well, the challenge which I and a number of others have set for ourselves is, given the reality of a highly competitive relationship between the two of them, what sort of strategic guardrails can you construct around the relationship to keep it broadly on track and without, as it were, triggering by accident crisis, conflict, or war? And that forms the organizing, as it were, logic for why you would try and devise something called managed strategic competition. The alternative, by the way, is unmanaged strategic competition, and that can take you back on the ride through Luna Park via Blackpool and on to Coney Island again and off the edge. So what are the sort of guardrails we talk about here? Number one is around the irreconcilable national security interests, to have a level of understanding about each other's red lines at the highest levels of government internally in Beijing and Washington, so that each side knows that if you go beyond those guidelines, that you're going to trigger a response, a significant national security response, and therefore creating of itself a level of mutually accepted mutual deterrence about taking such a course of action, whether that's over Taiwan, East China Sea, South China Sea, or cyber, for example. Second principle is, in non-critical national security domains and the rest of foreign policy, and in trade and investment, and in technology and in capital markets, as well as other domains like in the ideological divide on human rights, that this will be a vigorous, competitive relationship between the two, and the overall principle at stake should be, may the best system win this significant competition. But in the absence of the risk of spiraling off into crisis, conflict, and war, hence the first, as it were, set of principles around fundamental national security interests. And the third basket, if you like, in this framework of managed strategic competition is what I describe as strategic collaboration, not just on questions such as climate change, which we've just spoken about, but also, frankly, on the next pandemic, whenever it comes, because we've had multiple coronaviruses over the last 20 years. This one got completely out of control. The two prior to that, SARS as well as H1N9, came close to getting out of control. And so the question is, how do we learn from this complete implosion and failure of international governance this time round to make the structural as it were, lessons arising from what happened with the coronavirus crisis applicable for the future. And finally, in the world of finance, combined global debt management, for example, through the agencies of the G20, the Financial Stability Board, the Basel Committee, the Paris Club, and the Paris Club's negotiation with the Chinese on, shall we say, sovereign debt rescheduling, if and when that becomes necessary to avoid any sovereign crisis arising, as we've seen at other periods of international financial history, with often diabolical consequences for the rest of the stability of the financial system.
Yeah, thank you for that. I mean, just picking up on something you said there around the competition. So focusing just for a moment on competition and globalization. Although China continues to largely be the manufacturing powerhouse of the world, do you think that there'll be any decoupling of dependencies or any change in supply chain dynamics in the short or medium term?
I think all serious corporates around the world engaged in, let's call it, physical trade, as opposed to services trade, as opposed to necessarily international capital movements. Those engaged in physical trade, everything from semiconductors to other widgets, through to, frankly, resources and energy and manufactured products on the way through, are now in a process of re-examining the long-term stability and security and reliability of their global supply chains. Chinese corporations are looking at that from their own national perspective, given the disruptions to global technology trade, which began at the end of the Trump administration. Most, of course, related to the status of companies like Huawei, the rollout of 5G, and their dependency on certain US or US allied manufactured semiconductors. So I think this process of review is underway anyway. Secondly, if I was trying to put a crystal ball on it, in terms of which way it will go, I would say we're going to have some decoupling on technology. It will not be comprehensive. And in the rest of the global manufacturing space, then I think it will be at best partial, but not complete. And there's partly a reason for that, is that the comparative advantage still of China as the world's factory is real. Despite rising Chinese labor costs and the offshoring of some manufacturing into the rest of, let's call it, Southeast Asia and South Asia, there are still advantages for global consumers to still rely in part on the Chinese component of global supply chains. But here's a final point for people in the banking community to reflect on as well. China's deep national learnings from the trade war with the United States in 2018-19 was during the course of 2020 to begin to frame a new strategy themselves towards national self-reliance. Chinese characters are four characters, 自力更生. When I look at the Chinese literature on this subject, Chinese policy journals, etc., the whole notion of national self-reliance, which was always out there as a minor article of faith in the Chinese Marxist-Leninist system, has now occupied a much more central place in the literature. And when I look at the China 2025 strategy on high tech, when I look at its replacement strategy on tech, advanced in the 14th five-year plan released in March of this year, this notion of national self-reliance is no longer just a marginal concern, it's becoming a central concern. So where does this leave China long term and what they describe as the dual circulation economy model for China itself? That is, China's own domestic growth being generated increasingly by its own as yet untapped domestic consumer demand, and the world still being able to, as it were, access that Chinese market, is still on all things critical within this dual circulation of domestic demand and external demand. China will not wish to find itself in any way vulnerable on any individual technology or other key input factor in the future. And I think that is something which the corporate world needs to wrap their head around in terms of China's strategic trajectory over the next 5 to 10 years.
Yeah, thank you for that. Just picking up on the technology piece, technology has always been seen as an area of competitive advantage, but it can obviously also be a really effective enabler of globalization. Do you have any thoughts around how governments and governmental bodies can work together in order to facilitate better use of technology, particularly in things like digital trade?
Well, there is at present a growing, as it were, digital divide between Chinese forms of digital governance, American forms of digital governance, and European forms of digital governance. We see this writ large across internet governance, the Chinese and Russian model, if you like, which is maximal state control. The American model is often described as maximum corporate control. And the Europeans, perhaps being a little too self-congratulatory, regarding it as maximum citizen control, state, corporate, citizen. On the key question, though, of how to unfold and unlock what I think is this vast new domain of global growth in digital commerce, which has been accelerated through the experience of the current pandemic, where digital commerce has turbocharged itself in terms of the replacement of traditional commerce. A boon for the infrastructure businesses of getting product from A to B, but the actual transactional economy now being more digitally based. I think there is a real opportunity here for the United States to work with its Asian democratic capitalist allies and partners, and its European democratic capitalist allies and partners, on evolving a common platform and governance arrangement for the future digital commerce revolution. The United States, under the Trump administration, shot stone dead the Trans-Pacific Partnership and shot stone dead what was to become TTIP, the parallel free trade arrangement with the Europeans across the Atlantic. Well, the Bidenistas will find it difficult to breathe life back into those two stone dead corpses at the moment. But here's the possibility. Notwithstanding the protectionist politics alive among Republicans and Democrats in the United States Congress, you may be able to, as it were, extract digital commerce components of what was TPP and TTIP, and to begin the negotiation across the democratic capitalist economies of the world, a common platform for digital commerce. That, because it's separate from traditional commerce, technically separate from manufacturing, technically separate from other elements of the trade and services, may unleash a whole new, as it were, quantum of growth and wealth creation across the democratic capitalist world. But we need to make sure that the platforms are set up soon in order to do that.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with what you just said there, Mr. Rudd. Question, I'm just going to move across now. I'm interviewing a former Australian Prime Minister, so I can't let the opportunity pass to ask you a little bit about the focus around the current Australia-China relation. How do you think that we can move to get that back onto a more even footing?
Well, international relations at the end of the day is not all that complex. It's a bit like being on the dance floor. It takes two to tango. And at present, the Australians and the Chinese are standing on each other's feet. And so that this is no longer a tango. This is more like something which resembles a rock at Twickenham. And there is a difference in the artistic nature of the execution. So here's a couple of questions. One, will the Chinese take the temperature down? Given the interventions of the Biden administration on behalf of its friends and allies in recent months, basically indicating to the Chinese that if they wish to restabilize the relationship with Washington, they'll need to do so with America's principal allies in Asia and in Europe. Then I think there is a window of opportunity to do that, not to solve the fundamental problems, but to take the temperature down from the current, should I say, rhetorical fusillade in both directions. But going back to my tango analogy, on the Australian side, they will need to take the rhetorical fusillades down as well. And taking a rhetorical fusillade down does not mean that you're simultaneously prosecuting your core national interests and values with China. It just means that you're making more reliance on something terribly old-fashioned, but in the Mesolithic period we used to describe as diplomacy. And diplomacy is often a better way of solving these problems than pulling out a megaphone every Monday morning and having a good old blast from Canberra, and by Wednesday having a good old blast back from Beijing, on the assumption that in both countries it's assumed to be good for their domestic politics. I don't believe that's a sensible way to prosecute a bilateral relationship. When I was Prime Minister, we didn't do it that way. We had many differences with the Chinese, big ones. But by and large, we still grew the bilateral economic relationship, and we advanced the bilateral political and strategic relationship as well. So I think you can walk and chew gum at the same time, but that seems to be not on the repertoire table at the moment, but there is a way in which it can be done.
Thank you for that. No, I really appreciate your comments. Just shifting gears a little bit, in terms of the Asian society and the role that the Asian society plays, could you just give us a couple of minutes around the Asian society, how it operates, and where you feel the work that you do and the lobbying will be able to support some of the things that we've been speaking about?
The Asian Society is an American institution which was established way back in 1956. In fact, it's a Rockefeller institution established by John D. Rockefeller III with a view to building new bridges between the United States and Asia, including that stage, newly minted communist China, despite all the rigors of the Cold War. It was a fairly visionary concept when you think about it. The McCarthy trials are still underway on Capitol Hill, and Rockefeller said, oh, this is a bit crazy. We need to actually start building some bridges with these countries. And this was only really 3 years after the end of hostilities between Chinese and American troops in the Korean War. So that was the origin. Since then, our mission statement has been to build intelligent bridges between the United States and China, the United States and Japan, all the other principal economies and countries of wider Asia, East Asia, Southeast Asia, and South Asia primarily. And as our mission has broadened, we've also established centres, 15 of them across the United States, Asia, and now we're in Zurich, in Switzerland, and prospectively in other countries in Europe as well. And that's because there is a global demand for, frankly, informed and curated knowledge of how you deal with complex governments in the region, not least of which is China. And so to give a practical example of some of the work that we do, whether it's on climate change, for example, what we have done through our own second track diplomacy with the Chinese system and the Americans in the course of the last year or so has been, and this is prior to the last presidential election, was that if the Democrats were to win and the US policy was to change on climate, how could both countries hit the ground running on climate change action as soon as the new administration was sworn in? And we were able to do that at pretty senior levels on both sides. So that's part of our kind of bridge building mandate, despite all the Sturm und Drang, despite all the tumult, despite all the fireworks in public diplomacy and public politics. It's to actually navigate ways through problem solving. During the trade war, we would often find ourselves constructing unofficial memoranda to each government about ways to bring that trade war to a close, including the phase 1 trade deal. I remember we were invited to the signing ceremony for the trade deal at the White House in January of 2020. And then finally, on the questions of, shall we say, overall strategy, you mentioned before the work that we've done on managed strategic competition. It's to work with Chinese think tanks and American think tanks, both governments indirectly, on crafting possible ways through. So that's the sort of work we do. We're deeply active on trade and investment technology questions as well. And we also provide a secretariat services for the US-China Financial Forum. So we are fairly active across the field. And so with any of your members wishing to engage us, of course, we're around and ready to be of assistance. And we're always in the marketplace for financial support as well for the work of an American nonprofit.
No, that's great to hear. And I think one of the things that certainly we at BAFT would like to do is forge closer relationships with the Asia Society. So yeah, really great to hear that. And we'll reach out to you at some point in the near future, if that's okay. Unfortunately, that's all we have time for. So I really appreciate your time today. On behalf of BAFT, its members and those attending the conference, sincerely thank you, Mr. Rudd, for your time, your insights, and for the discussion today. Thank you very much. And on that note, I'll hand it back to Mike and James.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir.